Welcome to Bite the Talk, a podcast hosted by the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, known as GAIN. Join us as we discuss all things food systems related: diets, nutrition, environment, health, you name it. Meet fascinating people working in the nutrition and food community. Tune in to Bite the Talk and let's explore together.
Welcome back to Bite the Talk, the podcast that dives into stories, strategies, and systems shaping our global food systems. I'm your host, Mark Gachagua. Now, today we're exploring how nutrition and climate action are being consciously integrated across policies, finance systems, and national strategies. Progress is happening, and GAIN is part of it through its leadership in the Initiative on Climate Action and Nutrition, also known as ICAN. Today we're very lucky and also very blessed to have a wonderful guest who is going to walk us through this. I'm pleased to welcome Oliver Camp, who is currently the Environment and Food Systems Advocacy Advisor at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. Oliver brings extensive experience in nutrition and climate, working on policies and partnerships that bridge these two agendas. Oliver, welcome to the podcast. I hear people calling you Ollie.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I'm usually an Ollie, rarely an Oliver. But either way is fine. It's great to be with you on the podcast. I'm joining such a distinguished lineup of speakers from previous podcasts. So happy to be with you.
Thank you so much. What did you have for breakfast, if you don't mind me asking?
You know, I'm a regular and I'm a proper British boy here. Porridge every day. It's healthy and nutritious. Maybe some nuts and seeds for some of those healthy fats. It's a good start to the day.
It's good that you mentioned that. In my office, I have orange-fleshed sweet potato uji mix. Uji is porridge, so it's a good alternative to the other starch. And I think sweet potato is more nutritious than just having the regular maize, which is very popular on this side of the pond. So let's start, Ollie. Let's start with the helicopter view, as I like calling it. What are the connections between climate change and nutrition?
Yeah, it's such a crucial area, isn't it? Because, I mean, our world is defined today by our response to climate change. It's going to be such a huge issue over the coming years and the coming decades. And, you know, my view, and perhaps even our view as GAIN and ICAN, is that one of the key ways that people will experience the effects of climate change is through access to sufficient, adequate, nutritious food. There will be other impacts, of course. We'll see things like exposure to extreme heat and extreme weather events, climate shocks, climate disasters, which will have a major kind of acute effect. But in terms of the long-term impacts, I think food security, including good nutrition, and water security as well, will be two of the really key points that we'll have to look at. So this is what we try to do with ICAN. This is what we try to do as GAIN. And I guess just to outline some of the pathways, I mean, we know that climate change probably already is, and certainly is projected to have a major impact on yields of all kinds of foods, crop yields, but also things like livestock losses and changes to fisheries. So all kinds of nutritious foods will probably just be produced in lower quantities. And then there are other impacts which may seem a bit less direct, like the fact that climate change also has an effect on the nutritional content of crops. So we know that when there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, the nutrient content of crops goes down. That could have a major impact on people's nutrition, particularly for those who depend on staples, even for some of their micronutrients. And then other things that we might not immediately think about, like higher temperatures leading to faster spoilage, or of course, climate shocks and climate disasters just preventing physical access to nutritious foods. So there are loads of ways in which climate change is going to make access to good nutrition more difficult. As ever, the most vulnerable will feel this the most, both in terms of climate-exposed countries, but also in terms of people within those countries that might struggle to access good nutrition anyway, marginalized and vulnerable groups, people with higher nutritional needs, like women of reproductive age and adolescents and children. And then just to round this out on the other side, we know that unfortunately, diets also have an effect on the climate. So producing food obviously takes energy, it takes resources like land and water and agrochemicals. And unfortunately, all of those things can have a negative environmental impact. If we're using fossil fuels to fuel agricultural machinery, if we're having to clear land where perhaps there's forests to grow more food, all of these things can increase carbon emissions emissions. Things like production of livestock can increase methane emissions, and then there's a whole host of other environmental impacts that come along with food production. So to produce nutritious foods, we need to reduce the environmental impact to make sure that we're not exacerbating climate change. And then on the other side, we need to make sure that people have continued access to nutritious foods, even in the context of climate change. It really is a major agenda, Mark, as I say, and a difficult challenge for us all to work on, which really requires us to keep on working hard.
I agree, Ollie. I agree. And I can only imagine how countries and governments are trying to, the actions they're taking and how they're trying to strike this balance. From your end, have you seen any good examples of how countries are taking action to just make sure there's, for example, sustainable production of food and, them demonstrating some responsibility towards making sure they have climate smart agriculture and things of that nature?
For sure. And I think this is where we have to be optimistic and some cause for encouragement. We've seen, especially in the last few years, but maybe even for longer, that countries really are taking ambitious action on food. Countries around the world, and I think we needn't look further than the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021 and the process around that, right? I think over 160 countries now have a food systems pathway, and those pathways are really good because they tend to connect across all of these different issues: climate change adaptation, resilience, nutrition, food security, and then other areas of development like jobs and livelihoods and so on. And we're seeing increasingly that that's also reflected not only within that Food Systems Summit and pathway development process, but also within things like climate commitments. So we have these things called NDCs, the Nationally Determined Contributions, which are countries' climate commitments under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I would say, although we only have a few NDCs from the new round, they've been updated this year, I'd say there are already promising signs that countries are better integrating food systems, including elements related to food security and nutrition. And the same is definitely true on the national adaptation plans. That's another climate strategy that falls under the purview of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Countries with national adaptation plans really do see that food and nutrition security are a crucial part of that. And they do, as you say, build in things like climate smart agriculture on the resilience side, but also looking at other areas of the food system, like through the value chain, how we can cut food loss and waste, how we can strengthen infrastructure, and so on. I would just say there's a bit more to be done on that side, on the kind of middle of the value chain, on the diet side, so that we look beyond production only. But definitely, there's momentum, and there are certainly countries that are recognizing these issues, and there are certainly countries that have ambitious action on paper. Now it's a case of accelerating that action because, these problems are urgent, and if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, we only have 5 years to achieve everything that we set out back in 2015, so much more to be done.
Yeah, thank you, Ollie. I think you just mentioned the pathways, and I know many countries, they took some time to come up with these pathways, and there's some ambitious commitments that need to be taken into consideration, not to mention also the SDG goals. Now, I'm just assuming in this wonderful podcast called By the Talk, occasionally we do like to think that some government officials do listen in, and perhaps they don't have a very clear understanding of why climate and nutrition really, really matters. Why is aligning climate and nutrition so vital, and how is GAIN helping that?
Well, there are two ways of looking at this, and I think I've already covered some of the connected challenges. The fact that these two things do have an intimate relationship where climate change will exacerbate nutrition insecurity, and also, unfortunately, the production of nutritious foods and all foods can lead to climate impacts. But I think the other way to look at this is the opportunity. And, this is the main point I would really make to those government officials and to other stakeholders working in this space. There are so many connections that offer us win-wins. We are quite fortunate in some ways, in that often nutritious foods are also good for the environment, of course, depending a bit on production practices and so on. We're fortunate that there are some real kind of no-brainers, like cutting food loss and waste. That's great for environmental outcomes because we're not wasting resources. We're not seeing emissions literally from the rotting food, which is actually a major contributor to global methane emissions. And also that means more nutritious foods available for people to consume. So, that's a really obvious intervention area. And we're fortunate in that certain foods that we can choose to eat within our diets are, really advantageous for our nutrition while also having a low environmental impact. And when you pair that on the production side with sustainable production practices, you can have this wonderful thing of low emission diets, which are really healthy for us. Now, those connections, too good an opportunity to miss, if you ask me. So what we can do with our country partners, and this is an area where GAIN works, where ICANN works, is we can work on policies which seek out those win-wins, and we can work on plans which seek out those win-wins. And I think this is something that is going to be really necessary following the COP, which I'm sure we'll discuss, COP30 coming up quite soon, because countries are making these ambitious commitments, they've signed up to ambitious declarations, but now, as I say, we need to accelerate action and really see where those programmatic interventions lie, where those investments lie that can tap into all of these great opportunities.
Fantastic, Ollie. And thank you for leading this piece of work again. I know you've been on the forefront on this wonderful initiative called ICANN. And I know ICANN tracks progress across several key areas. Do you mind telling us what those areas are and how progress is shaping up?
Sure, and I mean, I can speak to the logic that I was just outlining, that there are these win-wins. We have, limited time and financial and human resources, so we really benefit when we can find greater integration, greater efficiency, greater coordination. And I mean we in the broadest possible sense, right? That goes for investors, it goes for the private sector, it goes for governments, it goes for organizations like us. So it's really a case of how we can channel our efforts towards the highest impact interventions. And for ICANN, that means looking across different areas of policy, strategy, financing, a couple of other areas in the private sector and academia, to first assess and understand the extent to which we look at climate and nutrition in an integrated fashion, and then really to work directly with the stakeholders involved to improve the way that they're looking at these things as a joint agenda. So if you look back to 2023, we did this major analysis with ICANN partners to understand how integrated various policies were. So for example, you would take a climate policy like the NDCs or the NAPs that I mentioned, and you would look at the extent to which nutrition was integrated into them. Then you would do the reverse. You would look at things like national nutrition plans, and you would look at the extent to which they were responsive to climate change or considering sustainability criteria. And we did that for a whole host of policies and strategies, things like food-based dietary guidelines, public procurement policies. Then we looked at finance, so we looked at things like the GCF or the World Bank or ODA, so Development Assistance Finance. And then we looked at things like private sector behavior by using things like the World Benchmarking Alliance rankings. And what you find is that there are so many opportunities to improve the integration of these two areas, climate and nutrition. You find that climate policy can become more nutrition sensitive. You find that nutrition policies can be more climate sensitive. And you certainly find that the big financing portfolios could just build in these kind of co-benefits and this thinking around taking a more holistic approach. That's not to say there are no good examples of integration already. There are plenty of good examples of integration. And I think that as we're renewing this report, we've committed to doing this analysis every 2 years. So we're renewing right now ahead of COP30. I think we'll see some encouraging signs. Again, there are more funders that are looking to integrate food security and nutrition outcomes within their funding, especially the climate funders. There are indications that countries in their NDCs and NAPs are including food systems, including nutrition and food security outcomes again. So I think good signs, but as ever, and I know I keep mentioning this, just so much more work to be done. We really do need to support not only on the policy development, strategy development, but also on the implementation of all of these.
It's really good to hear that there's some funders who are interested in supporting these bit of work. And I agree with you. I mean, we can have immaculate plans and very, very nice strategies, but implementation is really key because without it, we can't really move. I'm happy that you alluded to some of the examples. Do you know of any countries who are setting good examples in integrating climate and nutrition and being sensitive to this area? Or maybe from the report?
Yeah, I'm not cautious about picking favorites because so many countries are doing such good work, and as ever, they're getting context specific, and every country has to approach these challenges in different ways. There are hardly two countries alike. I think the point for me is really making sure that no country is missing opportunities where there are these opportunities to connect across these two agendas, and as I say, optimize the kind of efficiency and use of resources, their channeling of their efforts, channeling of finances. And there are some examples where I think we're seeing just more holistic and kind of rounded approaches that look at multiple outcomes across climate mitigation, climate adaptation, food security and nutrition, and so on. A couple that come through just from the new analysis, and maybe I should point to our report, which should come out at the end of October. But I think that Cambodia has some really wide-ranging and interesting points integrated into their policy, their NDC. That's especially encouraging because they're one of the countries in this initiative called the Alliance of Champions for Food Systems Transformation, ACF. And I think seeing that countries have have committed to high ambition and then have followed through by incorporating more on food systems within their climate plans is really encouraging. And some of the other interesting examples, the small island developing states, really so many of them have very well developed and very comprehensive NDCs, especially. The UAE is one, Barbados is another. And so that's really encouraging. And then, some of the countries that we know well from the African continent, like Somalia has some really interesting commitments. Lesotho has some interesting commitments. So there are so many. But as I say, this is not to say that others are missing loads of opportunities. It's just to say that perhaps there are areas where we need to make those connections more directly. One point I might add to that, Mark, is that generally speaking, the overall policy framework can be really comprehensive, but often different parts of policy at national level live in different ministries, departments, agencies, and it can be difficult to connect across. We have this situation where, let's take Brazil. They have amazing food and agriculture policies and strategies, but not all of those are reflected in the climate policy framework, or at least not yet. They're working on some new plans in the coming months. And I just think that sometimes those are the opportunities to connect horizontally within countries so that we can really make sure that each different part of the policy framework, where they are related, food, climate, nature, and so on, that they really are all speaking the same language. That's where I think we find the kind of optimization and efficiency that I've been speaking about today.
Yeah, Ollie, those are good examples. You mentioned Barbados and Cambodia, and my mind, went to nice vacations that someone can have there. But I'm happy to hear that there's some good progress that is going on there. Clearly, Ollie, it seems like finance is an integration gap when we talk about climate finance. What can be done to get climate finance doing more for nutrition? And I know we have COP just around the corner. What can be done to get climate finance doing more for nutrition?
Well, this is literally the probably $1 trillion question. Well, because we're just back from some encouraging meetings in Rome last week. The Standing Committee on Finance, which is a UN body under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, met to discuss exactly this, climate finance to agri-food systems. We met at FAO headquarters. There were meetings on food and agriculture around the meetings on finance. So it really was a good moment for these two communities to meet. So first thing to say, if you look at the ICANN report from a couple of years ago, we found that there was a relatively low percentage, really only a couple of percent of things like GCF funding or ODA, which went explicitly into nutrition outcomes. So alongside the main purpose of climate, were they also looking at nutrition? The answer that we found was only a couple of percent. Having said that, there is a small caveat to that, which is that we looked at specific language on nutrition within the project titles and descriptions. There could kind of be implicit nutrition benefits to some of the actions they found. But anyway, that caveat aside, I think it's fair to say that only a fairly small amount of climate finance is going towards food systems and nutrition. The SEF, the Standing Committee on Finance itself, I think estimated between 3 and 4% in their review last year. And that's crazy, right? Because, food systems account for about a third of greenhouse gas emissions, so you would imagine that they might get an appropriate share of climate finance. So what do we need to do about this? Well, part of it is, advocacy and drawing attention to this issue, but I think it goes a bit further than that as well. Food systems are really complicated. It's quite hard to work out where to invest in the food system, and as we know, it will look very different in different countries. Now, I'm not an energy expert, but I think we can draw a comparison with the fact that in energy, it's reasonably clear to see where the money needs to go into energy efficiency, into renewable capacity, and so on. In food, there are so many different areas that one could invest in, from climate smart agriculture all the way through the value chain, infrastructure and cold storage and processing and packaging, through to the fuels that we're using in production, whether it's on the farm or in fisheries, all the way through to diet side interventions to look at that connection between diets and climate change. And I think we just need to break that down really clearly as a community, and indeed when countries are applying for funding from the climate funders. It's really important that we have robust plans and strategies, really robust commitments sitting behind them, and then that we're translating those commitments into investable proposals with, the criteria that the climate funders have being met. So we need to show, how does this benefit climate mitigation? How does it benefit climate adaptation? How do we seek out co-benefits that are strategically important to the climate funders? And also, maybe most of all at the moment, how do we make sure that the money that they're putting in goes further? Let's bear in mind that climate finance has been lacking. It still is lacking. And even with this $300 billion target set at COP29 and the wider target to reach $1.3 trillion worth of climate finance through this thing called the Baku to Belém roadmap, we're still talking about relatively small pots of money when you consider that the food system is worth sort of 15 or 20 trillion. So we need to think about how climate finance from the public sources leverages private finance so that we can make that money go further, do more, achieve more. That's not an easy question because we need to find the kinds of interventions that the financial markets can sustain, that, private investment can see a return on. It's not an easy question, but this is where our efforts need to be channeled right now.
That's a very clear picture, Ollie, about what needs to be done. Now let's shift gears a bit and focus a bit on COP30. Climate negotiations continue to shape the global agenda. And I know COP30 will be another opportunity for different stakeholders and different people to do that. I'm just curious, Ollie, what opportunities do you see for nutrition to gain more visibility at COP30? I know that's very, very important. And how can we ensure that food systems remain central to the climate agenda? Because clearly there's a very nice and strong connection between the two.
I mean, this is a big moment and it's a unique COP. I think the first time we've ever had a COP in the rainforest, as it'll be in the Amazon in Belém in Brazil. And, it will be a really interesting moment. Let's not talk too much about the wider political context. It's a challenging moment, so we need to think about what we can achieve within that context. COPs are immense, so I won't go through all of the detail of different parts of the negotiations, but a couple of things that are interesting to look at. Firstly, we've talked a lot in this podcast about NDCs. NDCs were due back in February. In fact, they're rather late, and many of them are coming between now in September and November. I suppose the level of ambition that we see in those NDCs will really show us the level of commitment that countries are making to the Paris Agreement, which underpins the COP process. And I think that will set the tone. So that would be the first thing. Do we have a good number of NDCs? I mean, ideally, 195, but hopefully close to that. Certainly, do we have ambitious NDCs from some of the really big players? The US has submitted, but China, India, the EU. And then what do they include? Are they comprehensive when they look at different sectors? Are they looking beyond energy and looking at food systems as well? And, this is going to really set the tone, I think, when we see those NDCs come in, literally in the coming days. We'll have more to say about that. And then the next thing will be some of the new commitments. So for nutrition specifically, we're encouraged that Brazil is putting forward the so-called Belém Declaration on Hunger, Poverty and Human-Centered Climate Action. It links quite closely to the G20 Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty that Brazil launched last year, and certainly links to President Lula's agenda to end hunger. So that's encouraging. We have given a small amount of input to suggest that the nutrition components could be made more explicit. Sometimes we find that hunger and food security language sort of makes nutrition implicit, but it could be a bit more explicit, a bit clearer. But with a good nutrition component within that, that's a great place for countries to renew commitment. So at that sort of high-level political commitment piece, I think we have a couple of good things going on. Then you look at the initiatives. So there are two big initiatives we know will be launched on food or related topics. Firstly, this TFFF, the Tropical Forests Forever facility, which looks at finding new incentives through a new fund to preserve rainforest. That's great. Then obviously we know that one of the big connections here is that rainforests are cut down to clear agricultural land. So finding a way to reward countries for keeping that forest standing is definitely a good thing. We obviously need to think through the implications, right? Because we need to make sure that we are producing sufficient food without expanding agricultural land, which means that we need to work out how to balance the sort of land and food production question, which is often a controversial one around the climate debate. Then there's the second initiative, which is RAIZ, the so-called RAIZ initiative, which is all about land degradation, land restoration, regenerative agriculture. This is a really nice one launched by the Brazilians in that they've had recent successes with something called the Brazilian Greenway, which is all about land restoration. So it's nice to take that to the global scale. But you might say neither of those is explicitly about nutrition, and I would agree, which is where the next piece in the puzzle comes in, and that's the COP presidency action agenda. So this gets rather complicated rather quickly, but the COP presidency, Brazil, has come up with a set of themes that they want to shine a light on at COP, including agriculture and food security, and a few objectives within that, including a key objective on ensuring access to adequate nutrition and diets for all. Now, that's a really encouraging thing for us to see a COP presidency shining a light on, and so we're doing our best to support this by coming up with various solutions that can help to achieve that objective, and those solutions will be featured around the COP. So from this answer, I hope you can see there's a lot of good stuff happening at the kind of high-level political political agenda, and then more on the implementation side as well, with projects and programs and initiatives coming through. We will also have to make sure that the process itself is, still standing. It's a difficult time for multilateralism, but I think there's been really good engagement from all countries in the meetings leading up to COP. And so we're encouraged that despite the wider context, there will be something to show at the end of November.
Certainly, Ollie, certainly. I still want to linger a bit on the political commitment. And, I'm just imagining, and I had said this before, government official has gone to this big meeting, COP, and there's a lot of moving parts. Everyone is busy. Everyone wants to contribute and people want to listen. If you had, to name one or two priorities for governments going into COP30, what would they be, particularly focusing on climate financing and nutrition outcomes? I know you've touched on this quite a bit, but, just break it down, 2 or 3 priorities that they can focus on.
Yeah, and again, it will look a bit different for different countries, and our context will differ. But I think the first one is, really making sure that we're looking across multiple outcomes. So a lot of people who turn up to the COPs are more engaged on the climate side. In fact, until recently, we didn't that often see our friends from food systems turning up at COPs in the numbers we see today. So really look at multiple outcomes. It's not only about climate adaptation, it's also about climate mitigation, but it's also about co-benefits more broadly. Jobs, livelihoods, health, nutrition, food security, livelihoods for farmers, all of these different connected issues. And the reason I think that's so important is because once you're looking at multiple issues, you can think about how we find the win-wins. And there are win-wins, and that's the great stroke of luck that we have working in our favor. And then the point that you make about climate finance, I think it's really a case of looking at how we put together investable proposals based on the policies and strategies we have. The first step to this is making sure we have really robust policies, which helps the climate funders to understand that there is government interest, there is a government commitment to working in whichever area it is. So that's the kind of prerequisite baseline. But then it's really about breaking down what can be often quite high-level strategies. And Food Systems Pathway is a good example of this. Even NDCs, they vary a bit in detail. So it's breaking them down into specific sets of projects and plans even that can be invested by a climate funder and really trying to speak the language of the climate funders. This is, of course, where organizations that are supporting parties, member states, countries can come in. So I would obviously mention GAIN, but there are others as well that can help to really break down these high-level strategies into investable proposals, take those to the climate funders or even to the development funders, development banks, and really look for ways that we can accelerate action on the ground. You mentioned earlier, Mark, often the policies are good on paper, but what do we do with them? Well, I think this is it. It's about getting into the real nitty-gritty detail that sits below the high-level commitment.
I agree with you. And do you know what just came to my mind? I was just thinking, probably we need a Shark Tank on climate financing and things of that nature. I don't know if that's too a simplistic point of view, but anything to help to get the ball rolling. So, Ollie, we usually take a short, as we wind up, usually like to know from our guests, what was their favorite snack while growing up. I know this is very different from what you're discussing in COP. For me, growing up, that is in primary school, on my way back home, I enjoyed roasted maize with a dash of lemon and some chili, some powdered chili and some zesty lemon on the roasted maize. Oh my God, that's a favorite flashback. I'm just curious to know what you really enjoyed growing up as what was your healthy snack back then?
Thanks for adding the caveat healthy, otherwise I would have had to own up to something that wouldn't be approved by our audience nor by our organization. I mean, I'm definitely big for great fruit and veg, and living in the UK you get good fruit and veg, but when you travel around Europe you can find some really special stuff. I was recently in Romania, where my wife and her family are from, and just taking some of the fresh fruit straight off the tree, it's glorious stuff. But then the thing that is really my guilty pleasure, my sort of addiction, if I'm sitting near to some roasted salted cashew nuts, they're too good to refuse. That's a great snack, Mark, and you're tempting me now after this podcast. I have to go and get a handful from the kitchen, maybe 2 handfuls.
You should. It's all about inspiring people, isn't it? And when you get time, and I'm sure you can also fix some nice salad and pass our regards to your wonderful wife. Ollie, as we wind up, what is your parting shot? I know we've discussed a lot of things. What's your parting shot?
Yeah, I mean, it's just that these opportunities are too good to miss, that we have these win-win opportunities available to us. We can take action throughout food systems, throughout food value chains, which are good for both climate and nutrition. And all it takes is the commitment first, the creativity in the way that we think, and then the connection. So really working between different parts of government and all stakeholders to drive these co-benefits that we've been speaking about. It's a great opportunity. Let's not pass it up. And now is the time to do that.
Thank you, Ollie. As always, it's always a big pleasure to have you on the podcast and to also listen to you on various platforms. We'll tell our audience to follow you on LinkedIn. There's where you share a lot of goodies and information that can benefit all of us. So we are really happy to have you.
I'd appreciate that, Mark. That's very kind. I do try to share a lot there, so people are welcome to follow and hopefully find something encouraging or inspiring or useful. And thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Once again, thank you, Ollie, for guiding us through this critical nexus between climate and nutrition. The initiative on climate action and nutrition, also known as ICAN, the report shows momentum is building, but climate nutrition financing must come into sharper focus. Wonderful audience, if this episode sparked your curiosity, please subscribe, share, stay tuned for future explorations of bold food system strategies. Remember to follow Ollie on LinkedIn. Until then, stay informed, stay integrated, keep building food systems that nourish people and the planet together. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. Stay safe and eat healthy.